The rain was relentless, pouring down in sheets, so thick it felt like the sky had opened up to swallow the world. Each drop hit the ground with a cold determination, turning streets into rivers and soaking anyone unlucky enough to be outside. I was one of them, wet, shivering, and completely lost. My shoes squelched against the uneven pavement as I stumbled forward, my breath visible in the chilly air. Every step felt heavier than the last, not just because of the waterlogged clothes clinging to me, but because of the gnawing frustration bubbling inside. Where was I? How'd I ended up here? The unfamiliar streets stretched endlessly, dimly lit by flickering streetlights that did little to chase away the shadows. Fear crept in slowly at first, whispering doubts into my mind. What if no one found me? What if I couldn't find my way back? Confusion clouded my thoughts, making every decision feel impossible. Turn left or right? Keep moving or stop and hope for help? Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, lightning split the sky, illuminating the desolate landscape around me. And then, out of nowhere, he appeared. If you've ever wondered how quickly your life can change in moments of vulnerability, this is the story for you. Today, we're diving deep into an unforgettable encounter, a tale of trust, suspicion, and unexpected twists. You'll learn why even the smallest decisions can have massive consequences and how human nature often surprises us when we least expect it. By the end of this video, you'll see strangers in a whole new light, and maybe even question who you trust in a similar situation. Welcome to our channel, where we explore gripping real-life stories that challenge your perspective and keep you on the edge of your seat. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of curious minds. Stay till the end, because this story takes a turn you won't see coming. Let's dive in. The place wasn't familiar. It was one of those towns that seemed to exist in the spaces between places, small, quiet, and easy to overlook. The kind of town where streetlights buzz faintly in the distance, and the air smells damp, like it's been holding its breath for too long. I didn't mean to end up here. None of this was part of the plan that I had set out earlier that day with a clear destination in mind. A friend's house about an hour away by bus. A simple trip, or so I thought. But somewhere along the way, things went wrong. Maybe it was my fault. I might have missed the stop while dozing off, or maybe the schedule changed without warning. Either way, when I finally snapped out of my daze and realized no one else was on the bus, it was already pulling into this strange little town. The driver muttered something about last stop before shutting off the engine and leaving me stranded. The tea first. I wasn't too worried. I figured I'd just ask for directions or catch another ride back. But as the hours ticked by, the reality sank in. There are no taxis, no buses returning to the city. Just empty streets lined with weathered buildings and the occasional flicker of light from distant windows. And then the rain came, sudden, unrelenting, merciless. Within minutes, the world around me blurred into gray chaos. Puddles formed everywhere, swallowing the cracked sidewalks whole. The wind howled through alleyways, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decay. Every step felt heavier than the last. My legs burned from walking aimlessly, searching for any sign of life, a gas station, a cafe, anything. But there was nothing, just endless rows of darkened storefronts and shadowy corners that seemed to stretch on forever. My clothes clung to me like a second skin, soaked through and weighing me down. Every movement sent icy rivulets trickling down my neck and pooling uncomfortably in my collarbone. Even my socks were sopping wet, squelching painfully with each step. The cold seeped deeper with every passing second, gnawing at my bones until I could barely think straight. My fingers trembled as I tried to pull my hood tighter against the relentless downpour, but it didn't help. The chill wasn't just physical. It clawed at my chest, feeding on the growing desperation inside me. What if I couldn't find shelter? What if I froze out here, alone and forgotten? The thought made my stomach churn. Lightning flashed across the sky again, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the ground beneath my feet. For a moment, everything stood still, the rain, the wind, even my racing thoughts. And then, almost imperceptibly, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, steady. They weren't mine. I turned sharply, heart pounding in my ears. Through the haze of rain, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure approaching cautiously, their silhouette barely visible against the dim glow of a distant lamppost. My breath hitched. Was this real? Or was exhaustion playing tricks on me? In situations like these, survival often hinges on split-second decisions. Do you trust someone who appears when you're most vulnerable? Or do you run, hoping to fend for yourself despite the odds? This is more than just a story about being lost in the rain. It's about the choices we make when fear clouds our judgment. Keep watching to uncover what happened next and why this stranger became both my savior and my biggest question mark. The figure stepped closer, emerging from the curtain of rain like a ghost materializing out of thin air. At first, all I could make out was his outline. Tall and lean, shoulders slightly hunched against the storm. He wore a dark coat that shimmered faintly with water droplets, and a scarf was wrapped loosely around his neck, though it did little to shield him from the weather. His face remained shadowed under the brim of an old-fashioned hat, but as he moved into the dim light of a flickering street lamp, I caught a glimpse of sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes that seemed to weigh me down with their intensity. Need some help? His voice broke through the chaos of the storm, low and steady, carrying an odd mix of warmth and detachment. It wasn't exactly comforting, but there was something about it, a calmness that made me pause. I couldn't tell if it was genuine concern or practiced indifference, but in that moment, I didn't care. I needed someone. Anyone that I hesitated before answering, my instincts warring with desperation. I'm lost. I admitted finally, my voice trembling not just from the cold but also from uncertainty. I don't know where I am. He tilted his head slightly, studying me for a beat longer than felt comfortable. Then, without another word, he gestured for me to follow him. There was no grand offer of assistance, no reassurance, just a simple motion, almost dismissive. Part of me wanted to refuse, to cling stubbornly to what little independence I had left. But the other part, the part shivering uncontrollably and drenched to the bone, knew I didn't have a choice. As we walked, I stole glances at him, trying to piece together who he was. His strides were long and purposeful, cutting through puddles without hesitation, while mine faltered constantly, my soggy shoes slipping on slick pavement. Up close, I noticed details I'd missed before. The worn leather gloves on his hands, the scuffed toes of his boots, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly when he glanced over his shoulder to check if I was still following. He carried himself with quiet confidence, but there was something guarded about him too, like he was used to keeping people at arm's length. That we reached a narrow alleyway, tucked between two crumbling brick buildings. For a split second, panic flared inside me. Was this a trap? Should I turn back now? But then I saw it. A small wooden door set into the side of one building, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The stranger knocked twice, paused, then knocked again in a deliberate rhythm. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a sliver of warm, golden light spilling onto the wet ground. This way, he said simply, stepping aside to let me pass. Hesitation gripped me again, rooting me to the spot. The contrast between the freezing rain outside and the inviting glow within was almost painful. My body screamed for relief, but my mind whispered warnings. Who was this man? Why had he offered to help me? And why did this place feel so hidden, but exhaustion won out? I ducked inside, brushing past him quickly, and immediately felt the difference. The air inside was dry and smelled faintly of wood smoke and something herbal, lavender maybe. A small fire crackled in the corner of the room, casting dancing shadows across the walls. An old armchair sat near the hearth, draped with a patchwork quilt, and a kettle whistled softly on a nearby stove. It was cozy, almost too perfect, like something out of a storybook. You should get out of those wet clothes, the stranger said, breaking the silence. His tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind, but it sent a jolt of unease through me nonetheless. He turned away, rummaging through a chest by the wall, and pulled out a thick towel and a set of folded garments. Here, these might fit. Gratitude warred with suspicion as I accepted the items. On one hand, I couldn't deny how much better it felt to be out of the rain, to have warmth slowly seeping back into my frozen limbs. On the other hand, every fiber of my being told me to stay alert. This setup was too convenient, too picture-perfect. Who kept spare clothes lying around like this? And why did he seem so unfazed by my sudden appearance? Still, I forced myself to focus on the present. As I dried off and changed, I watched him from the corner of my eye. He busied himself making tea, moving with efficient grace, his movements precise and unhurried. When he handed me a steaming mug, our fingers brushed briefly, and I flinched instinctively. His touch was cool, impersonal, not threatening, but not entirely reassuring either. "Thank you," I murmured, clutching the mug tightly. The heat radiating from it felt like salvation, but it did nothing to ease the knot of tension in my chest. He nodded once, settling into a chair opposite me. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant patter of rain against the windows. It was peaceful, almost serene, but beneath the surface, questions churned relentlessly in my mind. Who was this man? What did he want from me? And why, despite everything, did I feel like I owed him something? In moments like these, trust is fragile. One wrong move can shatter it completely, or solidify it beyond doubt. Little did I know, this stranger's intentions would soon become far more complicated than I could have imagined. Keep watching to find out why this act of kindness turned into something far darker, and whether I regretted accepting his help. The room was small but undeniably inviting, though there was something about it that didn't quite sit right. The walls were lined with bookshelves crammed full of old, leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and faded from years of use. A few scattered candles flickered in glass jars, casting soft pools of light that danced across the uneven wooden floorboards. The air smelled faintly of cedar wood and something else, something metallic, almost sharp, that lingered just beneath the surface. It wasn't unpleasant, exactly, but it made my skin prickle. In the corner near the fire, a threadbare rug lay haphazardly on the ground, as if someone had tossed it there without much thought. Above it hung a painting I couldn't quite make out, a dark landscape shrouded in mist, with what looked like shadowy figures lurking at its edges. Every time I glanced at it, my eyes would catch on something different, a twisted tree branch here, a figure standing too still there. It felt alive somehow, watching me even when I turned away. The stranger moved around the space with quiet efficiency, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He added another log to the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward before settling back into his chair. His presence filled the room, not in an overwhelming way, but enough to remind me that he was always there, observing. I tried not to let my gaze linger too long on him, focusing instead on wrapping the quilt tighter around myself. The fabric was rough against my skin, yet oddly comforting, like it carried the weight of countless stories stitched into its threads. "You hungry?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice startled me, though he didn't raise it or change his tone. It was just there, cutting through the hum of the rain outside. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Accepting help felt dangerous now, but my stomach betrayed me with a low growl. "A little," I admitted finally, clutching the mug of tea closer to my chest. That he nodded once, disappearing into a tiny kitchenette tucked behind a curtain. Moments later, he returned with a plate of food, simple fare, nothing extravagant: bread, cheese, slices of apple, and what looked like homemade soup steaming in a chipped bowl. He set it down on the low table between us, along with a knife and spoon. Everything seemed clean and well-worn, like these items had been used many times before. But by whom? And why did they feel so prepared for unexpected guests? "Eat," he said simply, leaning back in his chair. His expression gave nothing away, neither warmth nor impatience. Just that same steady calmness that unnerved me more than anything else. That I picked up the spoon cautiously, dipping it into the soup. It tasted rich and savory, with hints of herbs I couldn't place. My body responded immediately, craving sustenance after hours of wandering in the cold. Still, every bite came with a pang of guilt, or maybe fear. Was this kindness genuine, or was it laced with strings I couldn't see yet? As I ate, he began to talk. Not directly to me, but more like he was thinking aloud. Storms like this don't come around often, he said, staring into the fire. They have a way of changing things. People get lost. Plans fall apart. There was a weight to his words, as if they carried meaning beyond the obvious. I wanted to ask what he meant, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way his voice dipped slightly at the end of each sentence, leaving trails of unspoken thoughts hanging in the air. When I finished eating, he took the empty plate without comment and placed it on the counter. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. For the first time since we'd met, he looked directly at me, his piercing gaze locking onto mine. "What brings you out here?" he asked. His tone was casual, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it, a curiosity that felt sharper than mere politeness. "I told you," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I got lost." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Everyone gets lost sometimes, but not everyone ends up here." His words sent a chill running down my spine, despite the warmth of the fire. What did he mean by here? This house? This town? Or something else entirely? I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Instead, I found myself glancing around the room again, noticing details I'd missed before. The books on the shelves weren't just random novels. They were journals, notebooks, maps. Some of them had strange symbols etched onto their covers. Others were bound in materials that looked unsettlingly organic, like animal hide. And then there was the clock. It sat on the mantel above the fireplace, ticking loudly in the otherwise quiet room. At first glance, it seemed ordinary enough, but when I looked closer, I realized the hands moved backward. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, counting down instead of up. My heart skipped a beat. How had I not noticed that earlier? The stranger followed my gaze and chuckled softly. "Time works differently here," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "You'll get used to it." My grip tightened on the quilt. "What do you mean here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and walked over to one of the shelves, pulling down a journal with a worn cover. He flipped it open and handed it to me. The pages were filled with handwriting, neat, precise, obsessive. Dates, names, notes scrawled in margins. Some entries were crossed out violently, others circled repeatedly. One phrase caught my eye. Asterisk, "the storm always leads them to me." Asterisk, I froze, staring at the words until they blurred together. When I looked up, the stranger was watching me intently, his expression unreadable. "You're not the first person I've helped," he said quietly. "And you won't be the last." Something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The fire crackled louder, the shadows stretching longer across the walls. My pulse quickened. What had started as shelter now felt like a trap, closing in slowly, deliberately. Yet, despite the rising unease, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something about this man and this place held me captive, as if stepping outside would mean losing more than just the warmth of the fire. Little did I know, the real test of trust was only beginning. Keep watching to uncover what secrets this stranger was hiding, and whether I could escape before it was too late. The rain outside showed no signs of letting up, and neither did the stranger's quiet persistence. After handing me the journal, he settled back into his chair, watching as I flipped through its pages. Each entry was a puzzle, some written in short bursts, others sprawling across multiple pages, but they all shared one common thread. People who had come to this house seeking refuge during storms. "You've helped a lot of people," I said finally, my voice tentative. I wasn't sure if it was a question or an observation, but he nodded slowly, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Not everyone makes it out," he replied cryptically, his gaze flickering toward the backward ticking clock on the mantel. "But those who do, well, let's just say they remember me." His words sent another shiver down my spine, but instead of fear, curiosity took hold. Who was this man, and why did he seem so detached from normalcy? I closed the journal and set it aside, meeting his eyes for the first time since we'd sat down. "What about you?" I asked. "Why are you here?" He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his tone lighter than before, almost wistful. "I used to travel a lot, always chasing something, adventure, answers, maybe even trouble. But one day, I ended up here, same as you. Only difference is I never left." His admission caught me off guard. There was a sadness in his voice, a weight that hinted at a life full of regrets. It softened him somehow, made him feel less like a shadowy figure and more like someone carrying scars too deep to heal. "What stopped you from leaving?" I pressed, leaning forward slightly. He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say the storm has a way of keeping people where it wants them." Before I could ask what he meant, he changed the subject abruptly, gesturing toward the fire. "You strike me as someone with stories to tell. Most people who end up here do. So what's yours?" At first, I hesitated. Sharing personal details felt risky, especially with someone so enigmatic. But there was something disarming about the way he looked at me. Not judgmental, not prying, just curious. Like he genuinely wanted to know. "I was visiting a friend." I began slowly, choosing my words carefully. It was supposed to be simple, a weekend trip, nothing special. But things went wrong, and now I trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the room around us. "Now you're stuck with me," he finished, raising an eyebrow. When I didn't respond, he chuckled softly. "Don't look so glum. You're safe here for now." "For now," I echoed, unable to keep the unease out of my voice. He shrugged nonchalantly. "Nothing lasts forever. Not storms, not shelters. Certainly not trust." His words lingered in the air between us, heavy with implication. Yet despite his ominous tone, or perhaps because of it, I found myself wanting to dig deeper. There was a magnetism to him, a pull I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way he spoke, always skirting the edge of revelation without ever fully stepping over. Or maybe it was the fact that, despite everything, he hadn't given me any reason to distrust him yet. Over the next hour, our conversation drifted unpredictably, touching on topics both mundane and profound. We talked about books. He recommended a few titles I'd never heard of, pulling them from the shelves with practiced ease. He told me about his travels, describing faraway places with vivid detail. At one point, he even laughed when I admitted I'd once gotten lost in my own neighborhood after taking a wrong turn. "That's how most great journeys start," he quipped, his grin momentarily lighting up the room. "Getting thoroughly, hopelessly lost." There were moments of levity, yes, but also glimpses of vulnerability. Once, when I asked him about family, his expression darkened briefly before he brushed the topic aside. "Some wounds don't heal," he muttered under his breath. Staring into the fire, as the night wore on, I started to notice subtle shifts in his demeanor. The guardedness that had defined him earlier began to soften, replaced by something warmer, more human. He offered me another blanket when I shivered, refilled my tea without being asked, and listened intently whenever I spoke. By the time the candles burned low and the rain began to taper off, I realized something unsettling. I trusted him. Not completely, of course. There were still questions gnawing at the edges of my mind. Why did he live like this? What did he mean about not everyone making it out? But for now, those doubts felt distant, overshadowed by the comfort of his presence. When I finally worked up the courage to thank him, his response surprised me. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the dying embers of the fire. "Tomorrow will be harder than today." My stomach tightened at his words, but before I could ask what he meant, he stood and stretched, signaling the end of our conversation. "Get some rest," he instructed, pointing to the old armchair near the hearth. "You'll need it." As I curled up under the quilt, exhaustion finally overtaking me, I replayed the evening in my mind. His kindness, his cryptic warnings, his quiet intensity. It all added up to a man who defied easy explanation. Part of me wondered if I'd dreamed the entire encounter, conjured it out of desperation and fatigue. But the warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of the rain outside reminded me otherwise. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by fragments of dreams and the occasional creak of floorboards as the stranger moved about the house. Somewhere in the haze between wakefulness and slumber, I realized something unsettling. While I may have started to trust him, I still didn't know what his intentions truly were. Keep watching to uncover whether that trust was misplaced, and what price I might pay for believing in a stranger who seemed to know far more than he let on. Morning came reluctantly, the gray light of dawn filtering weakly through the rain-streaked windows. The fire had burned down to embers during the night, leaving the room colder than it had been before. I woke slowly, my body stiff from sleeping in the armchair, and blinked against the dull glow of daylight. For a moment, I forgot where I was, until I saw him. The stranger stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the pale light. He wasn't looking outside. Instead, he seemed focused on something in his hands. It took me a second to realize what it was. One of the journals from the shelves. His fingers traced the spine absently, as if he were lost in thought. When he noticed I was awake, he turned toward me, slipping the book back onto the shelf without a word. "Sleep well?" he asked, his tone casual but distant. I nodded, sitting up and rubbing my eyes. "Better than expected." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. You'll need your strength today." His words sent a flicker of unease through me, but I pushed it aside. Maybe it was just his way of speaking, cryptic, deliberate. After all, hadn't he helped me? Hadn't he offered shelter when I had nowhere else to go? Still, as the morning wore on, tiny cracks began to form in the illusion of safety he'd created. They weren't obvious at first, just little things that gnawed at the edges of my awareness. Like how he avoided answering certain questions, or how his gaze lingered too long when he thought I wasn't looking at tea breakfast, a simple meal of bread, cheese, and coffee. He mentioned needing to check on something outside. "Won't be long," he said, grabbing a lantern from the counter. But when he opened the door, I caught a glimpse of the backyard, or rather, the lack of one. Instead of grass or trees, there was only fog, thick and impenetrable, rolling endlessly like an ocean frozen in motion. "What's out there?" I asked, unable to hide the curiosity in my voice. He paused, his hand still gripping the doorknob. "Nothing you need to worry about," he replied evenly, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place echoed in the silence. My pulse quickened. Why had he been so evasive? And why did the fog feel unnatural? When he returned a few minutes later, he carried a bundle of herbs tied together with twine. He set them down on the table without explanation, brushing dirt off his gloves. "For the stew tonight," he said simply, as if that explained everything. But it didn't. Not really. Because now I couldn't stop thinking about the fog and the fact that he hadn't answered my question. Later, while he busied himself tidying up the kitchen, I wandered over to the shelves again. Something about those journals kept pulling me in, even though I knew I shouldn't pry. I ran my fingers along their spines, pausing at one with a cover stained dark brown, almost black. As I pulled it out, a scrap of paper fluttered to the floor. Bending down to pick it up, I froze. It was a map, but not like any map I'd ever seen. The lines were jagged, almost frantic, crisscrossing in ways that made no sense. In the center was a circle marked with an X, surrounded by symbols that looked eerily familiar. Where had I seen them before? I flipped the page over. On the back, written in shaky handwriting, were two words, "They come." A creak behind me made me whirl around. The stranger stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Found something interesting?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. I didn't mean to snoop," I stammered. Shoving the journal back on its shelf, he stepped closer, his boots making soft sounds against the wooden floor. "No harm done," he said, though his eyes told a different story. "Just remember, not everything here is meant for visitors." His choice of words stuck in my mind long after he walked away. Visitors. That's what he called me. Not a guest, not someone seeking help, but a visitor. Did others come here often? And if so, what happened to them? As the day dragged on, more inconsistencies surfaced. There was the clock on the mantel, its hands still ticking backward. Every time I glanced at it, I swore the numbers changed slightly, as if time itself were bending to his will. Then there was the painting above the fireplace. The shadowy figures in the mist seemed closer now, their shapes sharper, more defined. And then there were the noises. Faint scratching sounds coming from somewhere deep within the house, like nails dragging across wood. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I asked him about it, he dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. Old houses settle, he said, avoiding my gaze, but old houses don't settle like that. By evening, doubt had taken root in my mind, spreading like ivy through every thought. Was this man truly helping me? Or was he hiding something far darker? The warmth of his hospitality clashed with the chill of unanswered questions, leaving me torn between gratitude and suspicion. Yet, despite everything, I stayed silent. Partly because I didn't want to offend him, and partly because I wasn't ready to confront the truth. Not yet. Keep watching to find out whether I uncover the secrets hidden in this strange house, or become another chapter in the stranger's mysterious journal. It was late afternoon when the turning point came. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a heavy stillness that pressed against the windows like an unwelcome visitor. I sat by the fire, staring into its flickering flames, trying to piece together the fragments of unease swirling in my mind. The stranger had been unusually quiet since breakfast, retreating to a corner of the room where he pored over one of his journals, scribbling notes with intense focus. His pen scratched rhythmically against the paper, a sound that should have been soothing but instead grated on my nerves that I tried to distract myself by flipping through the stack of books he'd recommended earlier. They were strange choices, tales of wanderers lost in endless storms, accounts of people who vanished without explanation. Each story felt eerily familiar, as if they mirrored my own predicament. Was this coincidence? Or was it deliberate? As I reached for another book, something caught my eye, a glint of metal tucked beneath the edge of the rug near the hearth. Kneeling down, I pulled at the fabric and uncovered a small brass key. It looked old, worn smooth from years of use, and it didn't seem to belong to anything in the main room. My heart began to race. Why would someone hide a key here? And what did it unlock? Before I could think better of it, I slipped the key into my pocket. A voice in the back of my head screamed caution, but curiosity outweighed fear. Whatever secrets this house held, I needed answers, and this might be my only chance to find them. The stranger glanced up briefly from his writing, his sharp gaze sweeping over me before returning to the page. "Everything okay?" he asked casually, though there was a faint edge to his tone. "Fine," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just looking around." He nodded once, apparently satisfied, and went back to his work. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew exactly what I was doing or planning to do. Later, while he stepped outside to gather more wood for the fire, I seized the opportunity. Moving quietly, I began searching the house. The key had to fit something, and I wasn't leaving until I found out what. The kitchen yielded nothing but dusty cupboards and mismatched dishes. The bathroom was equally unremarkable, save for a cracked mirror that sent distorted reflections staring back at me. Finally, I made my way upstairs, each creak of the floorboards making me wince. At the end of the narrow hallway stood a door, slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I found myself in a dimly lit study. Unlike the rest of the house, this room felt alive. Papers scattered across a desk, maps pinned haphazardly to the walls, and shelves crammed with jars containing something. I leaned closer, squinting at the contents. Were those feathers? Bones? My stomach churned, and in the center of the desk sat a locked wooden box. My fingers trembled as I pulled the brass key from my pocket and inserted it into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and I lifted the lid slowly. Inside was a collection of photographs. Faded Polaroids of people I didn't recognize, their faces frozen in expressions of confusion or fear. Beneath the photos lay a folded piece of paper. Unfolding it, I discovered a list of names scrawled in ink. Some were crossed out, others circled repeatedly. At the bottom of the page, written in bold letters, were two words: next arrival. My blood ran cold. Beside those words was a date, and it matched today's. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Panic surged through me as I shoved the box back into place and scrambled to my feet. The stranger appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with intensity. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I got curious. I stammered, clutching the edge of the desk for support. "I wanted to see what?" He interrupted, taking a step closer. "What lies beyond the stories I tell? What secrets I keep hidden?" His words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the tension crackling between us like static electricity. Then, without warning, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair, his demeanor shifting abruptly. "You weren't supposed to find that," he admitted, gesturing toward the box. "But now that you have," he trailed off, his voice tinged with regret. "You deserve to know the truth." My pulse thundered in my ears. "What truth?" He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "This house is not just a shelter. It's a waypoint. People come here during storms, seeking refuge. But not everyone leaves. Some stay because they can't face what's waiting for them outside. Others," he paused, his jaw tightening, "others don't get the choice." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Are you saying that you're not the first person to end up here?" he finished for me. "Yes, and you won't be the last." The weight of his confession hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, piecing together everything I'd seen. The backward ticking clock, the foggy backyard, the cryptic entries in the journals. None of it added up to anything good. "I need to leave," I said suddenly, stepping toward the door. "No." His voice was sharp, commanding. "You don't understand. If you go now, you'll never make it. The storm, it isn't done with you yet." His words froze me in place. "What do you mean?" He closed the distance between us, his expression urgent. "The storm brought you here for a reason. To escape it, you'll have to trust me completely. But if you run," he let the sentence hang unfinished, his meaning clear. "Trust him, or risk becoming another name on his list." The weight of his words pressed down on me, but I couldn't stay. Not now. Not after everything I'd seen. My mind raced as I tried to formulate a plan, each thought colliding with the next in a chaotic scramble for survival. The stranger stood between me and the door, his presence both intimidating and suffocating. I had to act fast, or risk losing my chance entirely. "I'm not staying," I said firmly, though my voice trembled. "I don't care what you say. I'm leaving." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might try to stop me. But instead, he stepped aside, his expression unreadable. "Suit yourself," he muttered, turning back toward the desk. "But remember, you won't get far." His casual dismissal unnerved me more than anger or aggression would have. Was he that confident I wouldn't make it? Or was this all part of some twisted game? Heart pounding, I slipped past him and hurried downstairs. Every step felt like a betrayal of the fragile trust we'd built over the past day. Guilt clawed at the edges of my resolve, but fear pushed me forward. I grabbed my damp jacket from where it hung by the fire and pulled it on, ignoring how the cold fabric clung uncomfortably to my skin. I reached for the front door. I hesitated. Outside, the world was eerily silent. No birds chirped, no wind rustled through trees. Just an oppressive stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly. The fog lingered, thicker than before, swallowing everything beyond the porch in milky gray nothingness. It looked less like weather and more like something alive, waiting to swallow me whole. That I took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping outside. The air was damp and heavy, pressing against my lungs with every strained breath. I moved quickly, sticking close to the side of the house to avoid being seen. My footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path, each sound amplified in the unnatural quiet. Every noise made me flinch, certain that he'd appear behind me at any moment. When I reached the edge of the property, I paused, scanning the landscape ahead. The fog swallowed the horizon, making it impossible to tell which direction led back to town, or if there even was a town anymore. For all I knew, I could be walking straight into a trap, but staying wasn't an option. Not after seeing those photographs, reading that list. My name hadn't been crossed out yet, but how long until it was? I glanced back at the house. Through one of the windows, I caught a glimpse of movement. the flicker of candlelight reflecting off glass. He was watching me. Of course he was. That realization sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through me, spurring me into motion again. The ground sloped downward, leading into a dense cluster of trees. I plunged into the underbrush, branches snagging at my clothes and scratching my arms. The farther I went, the darker it became. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy above. Shadows danced around me, shifting shapes that played tricks on my already frayed nerves. Every snapping twig sounded like footsteps, every rustle of leaves like whispers calling my name. And then I heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the wind. But as I slowed to listen, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps. Behind me, my chest tightened, and I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks in my haste. The forest seemed endless, its labyrinthine paths twisting unpredictably. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. Fear fueled my legs, driving me deeper into the unknown. Suddenly, I tripped, landing hard on the wet earth. Pain shot through my palms as I caught myself, dirt caking beneath my nails. Gasping for air, I scrambled to my feet, only to freeze when I heard his voice. "You can't outrun the storm." It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing faintly through the trees. I spun around, searching for him, but the fog obscured everything. His silhouette materialized briefly in the distance, standing unnaturally still among the shadows. Then, just as quickly, he vanished. Panic surged anew, choking me with its intensity. I turned and ran again, blind to anything but the desperate need to escape. Tears blurred my vision, mixing with the sweat dripping down my face. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for relief, but I didn't dare stop. Then, abruptly, the ground gave way beneath me. I cried out as I tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling uncontrollably until I landed in a heap at the bottom. Dazed and disoriented, I lay there for a moment, staring up at the sky through the thinning fog. My body ached, my head throbbed, and worst of all, I realized I had no idea where I was anymore. A shadow loomed over me, blocking out the light. I blinked, trying to focus, and saw him standing at the top of the slope. His figure was silhouetted against the pale glow of daylight, his features obscured but his presence unmistakable. "It's too late," he said quietly, almost sadly. "You should have stayed." He started descending toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. Panic clawed at my throat, but exhaustion rooted me to the spot. I wanted to fight, to scream, to do something, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was watch as he approached, closer and closer, until he stopped just a few feet away. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice trembling with desperation, but he knelt beside me, his gaze piercing. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "the storm doesn't let go." His words hung in the air, heavy and final. "Because sometimes the storm doesn't let go." I stared up at him, my chest heaving with ragged breaths, my mind racing to make sense of everything. Was this it? Had I stumbled into some kind of trap? A game where I was never meant to win? Or was there more to his cryptic warning than met the eye? He reached out, not to grab me, but to brush dirt from my cheek. The gesture was oddly gentle, almost tender, which only deepened my confusion. This man wasn't what he seemed. But what was he? "You think I'm dangerous," he said, his voice low and steady. It wasn't a question, shouldn't I? I shot back, my voice cracking under the weight of fear and exhaustion. For a moment, he didn't answer. He sat back on his heels, studying me as if weighing his next words carefully. Then, with a sigh, he began to speak, not defensively, but matter-of-factly, like he was explaining something inevitable. "I told you before, people come here during storms. Some leave, others stay, but none of them are random." "What do you mean?" I demanded, though part of me already suspected the truth. "The storm chooses them," he said simply. "And it brings them here for a reason." My stomach churned. "You're saying the storm is alive?" He nodded once, his expression grim. Not just alive, hungry. It feeds on fear, despair, regret, all the things that weigh us down. When someone gets lost in it, they're not just wandering aimlessly, they're being hunted. The pieces started falling into place, clicking together like fragments of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. The backward ticking clock, the fog that felt unnatural, the journals filled with names and the ones crossed out, the people in your books, I whispered, dread pooling in my gut. What happened to them? His silence was answer enough. They stayed, he said finally, because they couldn't face what was waiting for them outside, or because he paused, his jaw tightening, because the storm claimed them first. My hands trembled as I pushed myself upright, leaning against the damp earth behind me. So you're what? A guardian? A prisoner? A little of both, he admitted, his gaze dropping briefly. When I ended up here years ago, I thought I could fight it, escape it, but the storm doesn't give up. It keeps pulling people in, using them to feed itself. My job now is to help them decide, to stay or to leave. And those who leave, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Most don't make it, he said bluntly. The storm doesn't like losing its prey. That's why I try to warn you. Why I told you to trust me. Because if you run, he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. But you're still here, I pointed out, desperation creeping into my tone. Why haven't you left? His eyes darkened. Because I can't. Not anymore. Once you've been chosen by the storm, there's no escaping it. Not really. You either serve it or become part of it. A cold realization washed over me. All this time, I'd thought he was the predator. But now I saw the truth. He was just another victim, trapped in a cycle he couldn't break. So what happens to me? I asked, my voice breaking. That depends, he replied, standing slowly. Do you want to fight? Or are you ready to give in? As he extended a hand toward me, I remembered the painting in his house, the shadowy figures in the mist, watching silently. For the first time, I understood their significance. They weren't just images. They were warnings that I stared at his outstretched hand, my mind a battlefield of fear and determination. The storm loomed all around us, its presence palpable in the icy wind that whipped through the trees. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight for freedom, but something in his eyes stopped me. Not menace, not malice, but resignation. He wasn't the villain. He was as much a prisoner as I was. I don't want to stay here, I said finally, my voice trembling but firm. But I can't let it win. He nodded slowly, as if expecting this answer. Then go, he whispered. But remember, the storm will follow you. It always does. With that, he stepped back, melting into the fog like smoke dissolving into air. For a moment, I thought about calling out to him, thanking him, or warning him, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I turned and ran, pushing myself harder than ever before. Each step felt like defiance, each breath a declaration of survival. The forest blurred around me, shadows twisting and shifting as though alive. But this time, I didn't look back. I focused on one thing, moving forward. And then, just as my strength began to falter, I saw it, a faint glimmer of sunlight piercing through the haze. A road, civilization. When I emerged onto the asphalt, gasping for air, the storm vanished instantly, leaving behind only clear skies and silence. Relief flooded through me, but so did an unsettling awareness. The storm might be gone, but its mark remained. Deep down, I knew it wasn't truly over. It never would be. As I walked toward town, a single thought lingered in my mind. Storms aren't just outside us. They live within us too, feeding on our fears and doubts. Escaping them isn't about running away. It's about facing what they reveal. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through fear, trust, and survival. Stories like these are meant to leave us questioning our own choices, what we do in moments of vulnerability, who we'd trust, and how far we'd go to escape the storms in our lives. I want to hear from you. If you were in my shoes, would you have trusted the stranger? Or would you have taken your chances with the storm? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I can't wait to see what you think. That if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Every week, We dive into gripping narratives designed to challenge your perspective and spark your imagination. And hey, if you know someone who loves a good mystery or thought-provoking twist, share this video with them. Let's grow this community of curious minds together. Until next time, stay safe, stay sharp, and remember, sometimes the hardest storms to face are the ones within us. See you soon.